I was just talking to one of my good friends earlier this afternoon, and I said, so, I haven't seen him in several months since before the circuit breaker. And I said, how have you been doing? And he said, I've actually been really busy, and it's like, okay, so what have you been really busy doing? And that's just it. It's like an artist has to find a way to make themselves valuable to society. And the good artists do it. And they're more valuable and more important than ever. And you just have to figure out what it is that society needs and how you're going to meet that need.
Hey there, thanks for tuning in to another episode of the Careers of Millennials podcast. Are artists important in society? How can we be a great artist? I invite Associate Professor Greg Petersen to share with us his insights and experience as a musician before. He is now an Associate Professor in the Yong Siew Toh Conservatory of Music. If you've gotten any value from this podcast or would like to see more episodes, consider clicking the like or subscribe button below to let me know, and I look forward to bring you more Careers of Millennials. After spending many years as a professional bassist, Greg Petersen left the musical performance venues of the world and entered the academic world to focus on his interests in teaching and learning. He is particularly interested in the human relationship with the arts. Today, he is an interdisciplinary scholar and teacher, weaving together his colorful background and interests. The Yong Siew Toh Conservatory of Music brought him to NUS in 2005, where he still spends half of his professional time. Greg, thank you so much for joining me in this podcast where we can talk about music and the arts.
Always happy to talk about something I'm very passionate about, and I'm very interested to hear what kind of questions you have, and I hope it's of both interest and application to our audience.
All right. I think on just on the top of my mind, all right, and also recently in the news, you probably have seen this survey where roughly 71% of people think that artists are the number one most non-essential jobs. And that's, just to put it into perspective, it's actually comparing artists with many other jobs out there in society. So from your perspective as a professional musician, well, you have been you've performed in professional scenes before, and now you also teach music in university. What are your immediate reactions to this, and what do you think this means in terms of how society values artists?
If you can see my face, I'm smiling, very big, because these people have no clue what they're talking about. In the current situation, movie watching is up 70%. The last statistic I saw, music streaming was up 20%. It's like in these kinds of situations where we have a crisis, people always turn to the arts. I didn't go look at the statistics on reading, but I bet reading is also up, because in our current economic situation, 2020, COVID-19, a lot of people have had more time on their hands than they've ever had. And I don't think that they spend it studying how to become engineers or doctors or, all of these other so-called, I'm going to do something really productive and serious with my life. And it's like, no, we have to recreate. We need healthy forms of leisure. And to me, the stats that I've been watching related to the arts that I love, they're all up significantly. And so anyone who says artists aren't important to society, I think that they should stop watching movies and listening to music and reading books and doing all the other things that they've been doing that is brought to them by artists.
Yeah, I think now we know that artists that they are really important because they create something that is really still valuable to us. But it seems like society as a whole doesn't seem to value it as much as other forms of services like doctors, lawyers, and all that. Why do you think there is this disparity, and it probably has persisted for many, many years?
Well, in every culture and society, there is a hierarchy of professions. And the question is, which one's going to give me money, and which one's going to give me status? And so very often parents encourage their children to go certain directions with their lives and their careers based because they want their kids to have status. They want them to have importance in society. And part of that is because a lot of people don't understand what artists really do. I would actually argue that a lot of time artists don't really understand what they do and what they contribute to society, or at least don't articulate it in such a way that they help other people understand what they do. The artists who do a good job at articulating these things are actually making a pretty good living. Because they know how to connect with people. They know how to help them understand the benefits of getting them involved and participating, either as audience or as an amateur in these art forms. And they're actually doing okay. I would also say that we've reached a point because of the media world that it's possible for us to have fewer and fewer artists as we digitize them. So it's like, well, how many musicians do we really need? How many recordings do we really need? If we look at classical music, it's like, well, how many recordings do we really need of a Beethoven symphony? Right? Do we really need that many more? And the question is, well, what is it that you have to say? And what is it that an audience really wants to hear? And where is that connection with us as people and how we engage with people? And I think that we also have a tendency colloquially to emphasize the crazy artist. We talk about Van Gogh, the man suicided by society, and Gauguin, and some of these, I'm thinking of in pop music, some of the pop musicians that have overdosed and committed suicide, and so we have a tendency to focus on some extreme cases. But if we go back and we look at history, a lot of the artists that we study were actually brilliant businessmen and women. And they not only understood their art form extremely well, but they also understood people, and they understood how economics worked, and they understood how to make a great living in context of their own social economic environment. So it's a matter of how we tell that story. And sometimes the story that we tell in primary school and secondary school isn't a very good one. And the question is, why do we tell those stories, and what should the story of the arts be? In primary school, here in Singapore context, it's like we want children, and this is true in most worlds, we want kids to learn creativity. We want them to engage in the visual arts and the musical arts, and we get them involved in writing poetry of various kinds, correct? Because we say this is really important. But as soon as somebody says, oh, I want to do this for a living, all of a sudden all the alarm bells go off and go, wait. And I just think that's because too often it's misunderstood. And it could be that there's so many people pursuing it that really don't know what they're doing, that they give the profession a bad name.
I think I can really totally relate to that, because I also grew up in an Asian family, and I think the notion is that as a musician, you can't earn much. And statistically, it confirms that as well. There are official statistics released by the government on what are the starting graduate salaries for people or graduates who studied music. And it's way below the average. So at the same time, parents would also want their children to pursue their passion. So I can see why they would kind of like ask them, are you sure that you really want to do this? I think some parents would outright stop them from doing so. But I think maybe some parents would be a little more liberal with that. But at least in Asia, um, as you teach in the school, in the university, do all of your students have any parental objections, or they pretty much are able to pursue their passions as freely as they want to?
I don't think anyone's free to pursue their passion as freely as they want to, because we all have to negotiate the dynamics of our families. We have to negotiate the dynamics of society, and some people go to law school and their parents are really excited about it, and some people go to law school and their parents are not. Do you know what I mean? I feel very uncomfortable making a blanket statement that, oh, just because you go into this profession, the parents are going to be very happy. But I would say in response to this that I've never met any parents who don't want their children to be happy. You know, we want them to be successful, and we want them to do something that they're enjoy doing. And I think the biggest concern is that parents want some kind of assurance that if their children pursue a particular pathway, that they'll be able to figure out how to support them. Now, them being the child, them being the child in their family, them being the parents themselves, you know, as they age. But I think it's more important not to look at a profession and say it's successful or unsuccessful, as much as it is to say, well, if you're really going to do this, are you sure, you know, that you can figure out what to do and how to do it? When I was a teenager, and I was talking to people, you know, some people were like, well, do you really think you can make a living at this? You know, there were a lot of people that were very discouraging. There were people who showed me the statistics on how many people strive to make a living in the music industry versus how many people are actually successful, you know, at paying their bills. But you have to be realistic about whether you're actually being successful or not, and whether you actually have a trajectory that's happening with your career. And it doesn't matter what that is. I know people who have, you know, I know two people that have MBAs from very, very prestigious MBA programs in Northeastern United States, and they were unemployed for long periods of time. Do you know what I mean? Just because you go to one of the highest ranked schools in the world doesn't guarantee you a job for the rest of your life. You all have to be careful how you move things forward. And I've seen people major in law and medicine and who were very unhappy, and they left it because although they could make a really nice career, they weren't necessarily enjoying it as much as they wanted to enjoy doing something else. Does it make sense?
Yeah.
And so if you have a lot of people who say, you know, this is the economic view of art. Somebody says, what do you do for a living? And you say, well, I'm a bass player. But I am actually really not a bass player. I'm really just a total bum. You know, it's almost like somebody who's a lawyer says, what do you do for a living? And you say, well, I'm a lawyer. But the person has almost no clients because nobody likes the person, nobody trusts the person. They really don't have any work. And so I think we need to focus more on what are people able to do with their trajectory and whether they can be successful on that trajectory. And I think that there may be a lot of people who say they're one thing when really they're not. And that happens in the arts a lot. My favorite example of this is Los Angeles. That, you know, there's a joke that, you know, you talk to almost anybody in Hollywood and they all say they're an actor and actress, but they're actually all, you know, working, doing other jobs, trying to figure out how to become actors and actresses. And so in the economic point of view, you're not allowed to call yourself a member of that profession unless it is your primary source of income and you are able to support yourself. Now, if we were to use that definition, then we would have to say, now, how many people are actually making a living and they're actually being successful in their career? But we don't have a lot of people running around society, Andrew, saying, well, I'm an engineer, but I really don't work as an engineer, right?
Yeah, I think it's extremely competitive to be an artist, whether it's a musician or a painter or a digital artist, whatever you call it, right? I think it's extremely competitive because it takes a long time to hone the art to produce something that is good, that people would buy into, that you can eventually make a living out of. And you touched on a really interesting point earlier on about connecting with people, and artists themselves need to have some sort of sales skill to market themselves and really connect their art with what people want. So when you started your career, or you played professionally, at least in what I found in Walt Disney, and you also played for Warner Bros. What were what kind of mindset did you have going into that career back then, and what advice would you give to people who are starting out so that we can learn more from that?
For me, my mindset in playing music, regardless of what I was doing, was always the same. I am going on a musical journey, and I want to take you with me. I'm inviting you to come along. This is really fun. This is really exciting. This is something worth delving into and letting it become a part of you. It's a part of me. And now I'm going to share a part of me with you. And I want to see if I can make it a part of you. And it doesn't matter whether I'm in my teens and I'm playing in a dance band, or whether you're playing in a recording studio with a major motion picture company. It doesn't matter. The question is, why are you there? What is it you're trying to do? What is it you're trying to accomplish? I used to give the analogy. My earliest days in music, playing professionally, were in a dance band, and when you first show up, you've got a bunch of people, and they're all sitting around, hanging out, talking, and maybe it's a business party or a wedding reception, or whatever the occasion, or maybe it's a bar. But you show up and you start playing, and nobody wants to pay any attention to you. And sometimes you kind of start out as a nuisance. But for me, it's like I would imagine that I'm the engine of this massive freight train, and there's me, and there's the drummer, electric bass, drum set, and it's like, it sometimes takes time to build that momentum and to get it going. But for me, it's like I'm playing, and then it's like maybe during the first song, the only thing I get the people doing is bobbing their head a little bit, but I'm smiling because they're bobbing their head, and then I see them tapping their foot. And it's like, now they're bobbing their foot and they're the freight train is gaining some energy, and we're getting going. And, by the time you hit the third or fourth song, you've got, the dance floor is half full, right? It's like, right. This is what it means. I'm going on a musical journey, and I'm going to take you with me. And by the time that we're done, we have seen some amazing vistas, and we've went through some massive mountain peaks, and we've gone through some beautiful, wide open valleys, but we went on this incredible journey together over the last 3 or 4 hours. And then you see what people look like when the journey's over, and you see what healthy leisure does for a human being. For me, that was my motivation. That's what motivated me to get into music in the first place. And it's still the thing that carries me forward, even though I'm much more in academics, not teaching, how to play this note, or, what's the best fingering position to accomplish this. It's like that's a different world, but it's still about the music and how we connect to it as people.
So, Greg, you also did some scholarly research, and you've published in book chapters and journal articles. What are some of the valuable findings from your research in terms of music and the human relationship with the arts?
My major takeaway has been that things are not always what we think they are. In other words, there's an initial response of the way we think things are, or when we look at history, the way things were. And then when you actually start taking a close look in more detail about what is happening or what happened, things are not what they appear to be. And I think it's important that we sometimes step away from what it is that everyone else is saying, even in scholarship. There are a lot of scholarly. I've had some people tell me I'm absolutely nuts and I have no idea what I'm talking about. But that's sometimes because you're painting a different picture of the way things used to be. And it challenges the status quo. So one of the areas that I really enjoy studying is the early history of the violin family instruments in the especially the 16th and early 17th century. And that history in the 1980s was almost all written by people in the late 19th, early 20th century, and they basically made the early history of the violin look exactly like it did in the late 19th and early 20th century. And that's not the way things were. And so sometimes we have to ask ourselves, is that really the way things were? Or is that just our perception of the way things were? You know, I'm sure that if anyone, thinks about being with friends and secondary school, or if you're married and you have a spouse or you have a partner, and you say, well, this is my perception of what happened in that conversation or at that event, and then somebody else sometimes has a very, very different perception. And the question is, what's the value of studying that? What's the value of looking at it? Now you go back to the question. So one of the areas that I really like to study is the early history of the violin. And somebody says, well, I study infectious diseases, right? Mm-hmm. And you say, well, the person who studies infectious diseases is really, really important in society. And the person who studies, the origins of musical instruments is not. And that's typically the kind of thing that you have. But if you study the history of the humanities, a lot of civilizations and societies put most of their investment early on into the arts, because the arts was how they went about creating a sense of identity, a sense of belonging, and created their story about who they are and what's going to hold them together as a people. If we didn't have those things happening, then chances are we wouldn't have infectious diseases in the first place. Something has to bring us together as a people. Yeah. What is it that brings us together? And hence, if you say, oh, look at all of the things that we can do when we go to work, well, almost everyone can go to work except the artists. The concerts, haven't resumed. And even if you say religious events are canceled, why can't you go to religious events? Because people sing at them. And you have many people in close proximity. But think about what those kinds of groupings of people do in bringing us together as a people. And hence I would look at the role the arts play in society. And for me as an artist, that's the role I wanted to play in bringing people together. So I create the situations so the infectious disease specialists actually have a job. How's that?
I think that's really interesting. And now, even while we are working from home, could you imagine what is it like if you are at least a musician who is paid professionally? Could you imagine what is it like to still work from home? What would your plans be if you are a musician today?
Oh, if I were a musician under COVID-19, I would be scrambling fast, because for me, I liked playing live, and so my calendar was full of things where I was trying to be out in the evenings performing. And under COVID-19, all of those things are being closed, cut down. So one, my income stream has just died. And two, my ability to connect with people using music has just been cut. And so that means that I need to quickly create a different way to both connect with people and to make a living. You still have to eat, you still have to pay your bills, and so I found myself, of course, hypothetically, smiling, going, "Wow, I'm glad I'm not a musician. But what would I be doing?" And I found myself, thinking of some of the things that I would do. One of the first ideas that came to mind that I would have had a tremendous amount of fun with is doing music dedications. So you have a wife, right, Andrew? And so I'm going to do something and say I'm going to try and make myself available that I would like to do a song dedication, not like a radio DJ, because a radio DJ does a song dedication and they read this short little paragraph and then they play a song. It's like, no, I'm going to rewrite the words to the song. You tell me what you want your wife to hear. And then, and then we're going to have a conversation, and then I'm going to customize something or write a piece or do something specifically because you want to stay up, positive during this time. You want your wife to stay up and positive during this time. And so you do something that's quirky and fun, a little bit different. And I'm going to do this for you, and I'm going to make it possible. And I'm going to charge you maybe, $100 in order to do something like this. What I mean? It's like you have to start thinking of different ways. And then once, you can't do anything during the circuit breaker, but when the circuit breaker is not there, you can still do different things. I would probably be trying to get performances where I can play in front of someone's house at social distancing with a duo or a trio. And so now I've got this composition that I'm doing, the song dedication for this person or for this particular organization. And then I'm going to show up as a solo or a duo or a trio or whatever it happens to be. And we're going to perform this thing live. It's powerful, it's fun, it's really impactful. And then of course you have a business card. You have something where if it's a positive experience, this is how everyone builds their career. You say, oh, this is a positive experience. And everyone goes, wow, that was really cool. And you just hand out your cards like crazy, and it just starts turning into more work. It usually takes years to build up a reputation and a clientele. But I was just talking to one of my good friends earlier this afternoon. And I said, so, I haven't seen him in several months since before the circuit breaker. And I said, how have you been doing? And he said, I've actually been really busy, and it's like, okay, so what have you been really busy doing? And that's just it. It's like an artist has to find a way to make themselves valuable to society. And the good artists do it. And they're more valuable and more important than ever. And you just have to figure out what it is that society needs and how you're going to meet that need.
And what would you say to budding artists now who are probably just starting out their musical careers? What would you say to them in terms of where the opportunities are right now to connect with people, especially now that there are some technologies available, such as Facebook Live, your YouTube Live, Instagram Live, technologies like that. That could be a piece where they could connect with a virtual audience. And at the same time, what you just mentioned is to also do personal reach outs and connect with people on a personal basis so that they could really feel your music. But it can be kind of discouraging, especially when just looking at the survey and a lot of shows are canceled. It can be really very discouraging. I can imagine as in someone who's starting out a career in this, they might even start to question their decision to even pursue this. But yeah, I think it would be really sad to see someone to give up their passion just because it doesn't really make them a living for just what I think is a temporary downturn. What would you say to the artists who are still starting out their careers?
I would tell them to pursue the things that mean the most to them, and to make sure that they do not look to historical business models to help them make a living in the future. Social economic situations have changed dramatically, and and how money exchanges hands in the arts. But they are going to have to find a model that works for them. You can talk about all these streaming services that are available. There was a website that came up by a prominent musical education institution about all the things that musicians should be doing during the lockdown in order to stay alive actively musically and to capture an audience and all of these types of things. And it mentioned some of the things that you mentioned and a dozen other things in the article. And I just smiled because everything that was mentioned is an artist, musicians, creating their art form and then putting it on the internet for free. Now, that may be really fun and it may be really great for the consumer, but what's the business model for the musician? And so if you're going to be a performer, you'd better know what your business model is going to be and how you're going to make a living. Otherwise, you're just going to make a lot of music and you're going to give it away for free.
Well, I guess one of the business model is through advertising, where you try to get an audience and you put your music on YouTube, or I guess on Facebook you can also run ads on them. But I think it's really difficult to build a sizable audience that could make you a decent wage. So I can see your point here that as a musician, if I were a musician, I would also need to understand how the business of music, how the economics of music has shifted as a result of COVID-19, or even as a result of technological disruptions, and how people consume music. Well, just one interesting point I want to touch on is you've played live, and how would you compare that experience with playing through a virtual recording? How would you still try to connect with your audience? Because you probably can't see their reactions, so that wouldn't drive your performance that much. How would you still try to maintain a special touch with your audience?
You have to first be in touch with yourself. You are your first audience. If I'm a player, if I'm performing, I'm still listening to myself. And if I'm with an ensemble, I'm still listening to the performers around me. We are an audience. And then the question is, how far out, in other words, it's if we say, oh, here's a quintet on stage, and here's a 40-piece orchestra, and here's an 80-piece orchestra, and here's a stadium of 60,000 people, right? It's a matter of how this first happens within your own immediate circle, and then you have to. I'm going to go back to the dance band analogy I gave you earlier on. It's like I'm playing, but I'm trying to connect with you so that you bob your head and you tap your feet, and then everything else, starts, wiggling its way along as we get this freight train moving down the tracks, right? You still have to be able to see where the music is going. It's out there, it's part of me, it's part of you, it's part of us, and you have to be able to connect with the music and be able to sense and feel how other people are part of that journey, even if they're not there. It's still very easy to sense that collective human spirit as part of the journey. At least that would be my response. If I can go back, Andrew, for just a minute, you were talking about also, how we deal things in a world. I was a live musician. I was not a recording musician. I was a live musician. And even when I was in the recording studio, I was a live musician. It's just that somebody recorded it and then attached it to, a soundtrack, for example, or it was used in an advertisement someplace, or, you know what I mean? It was whatever the purpose is, or it went on a CD. But, when I was working as a bass player, a lot of times we would go into a studio and we would have a 40-piece orchestra, and then we would record the exact same segment twice, so that when it's done, it sounds like an 80-piece orchestra. And then sometimes you would go into the recording studio and you've got maybe 20 live musicians, and then you have about 5 to 8 synthesizer players that are playing everything else, but they sound like synthesized orchestra. They don't actually sound like a real orchestra. And I was really good when I went and watched a movie. I could tell you right off, this is a full live orchestra. This is half orchestra and half synthesizer players. Or today I listen to things, even in pop music, as we hear them come out, and go, they didn't even use a real bass player. That's a keyboard bass player. Do you know what I mean? And so if you want to make a living as a musician, you not only have to figure out the whole digital world, but you have to figure out what you do on your musical instrument that is not so easily replicated by somebody who has 10 fingers sitting down at a synthesizer. Right? And this is where I would always say I was a live musician, because I wanted to be able to do things that only a bass player would do, and not somebody just playing my part on a keyboard.
Yeah, I think nothing would really take away that human touch to music. You can compose music using software nowadays. You could just put in the notes and you would just play along, and you would play technically perfect. But I think as a human musician, there are some really minor imperfections that kind of make it sound more natural to that. Is that how I can understand human musicians versus computer composed musicians?
But we like flaws. We actually don't like perfection. We may go into a photograph and we may want to Photoshop it, and we may want to go in and remove that zit over here, or, the mole on the chin, or, do you know what I mean? But it's like a lot of times we're drawn to those things. We actually like them. We enjoy them. And I think too often we think that we don't like these imperfections. But what if the minor imperfections are actually the things that actually make it perfect? And,
it doesn't make it.
That's my response. My goal was not necessarily to play everything flawlessly, because sometimes that makes a very boring performance. Sometimes when the freight train gets moving down the track, so you've been in a car where you go around the corner just a little bit too fast. It's a little fun. You end up leaning on the person next to you a little bit. So sometimes there's this there are these moments of change that are so important. You think about music and the metronome, and everything needs to say exactly the same. And I remember listening to an interview with the most famous studio drummer who was alive at the time, and they asked him what he thought about practicing and recording with click tracks, metronome, and he said, but the metronome, he says you need to know where the beat is and you need to have a good groove. But he said a metronome doesn't know when to push the beat, and it doesn't know when to relax the beat. And that's really important. And we could say, oh, it's a mistake. It's like, no, that's what was supposed to happen.
Wow. I mean, that is a very nice paradox, that the imperfections make it a perfect listening experience like no other. It allows you to understand that this is a unique situation, and probably there wouldn't be any other time like this again. That's really interesting.
I'm okay with imperfections. They don't, if there are too many of them, yeah, they bother me. But I would rather have somebody who's really working to express themselves as an artist and make a few mistakes along the way than just try and figure out how to be as conservative and as accurate as possible. Now, that doesn't mean that some artists don't. I'm thinking of some musical performances that, it's like if there were any flaws, where were the flaws? It's like, well, sometimes the flaws are obvious. Maybe there are perfect performances, but maybe the flaws were just of a kind that they don't bother us. I'm thinking of the violinist, where sometimes, somebody plays up high and, or a wind player. Sometimes there are these notes that you reach for and you miss them and they're slightly out of tune, and you see people go, it's like, oh. And to me, those are distractions from the overall experience for some people, because they're looking for perfection. I'm looking for perfect intonation. Well, what is perfect intonation? Well, I'm looking for the performer to be perfect rhythmically. But what is the definition of that particular perception? And what is it that's driving that perception? And there are definitely different definitions out there. And we have to decide collectively in our cultures and subcultures where we stand in relationship to those.
What else do people do when they study music in university? I myself don't know anyone who studied music in the Yong Siew Toh Conservatory. So could you give me and some of the listeners an understanding of what do people do in the program, and what can they get out of that?
Okay, so if you go to a university and you study music today, it has a huge difference. Your experience will be vastly different depending on the university that you go to. Some universities are still running curriculums that look very, very similar to what they looked like 100 years ago, for example. And one of the things that I really enjoy about the Yong Siew Toh Conservatory music is we're not so embedded in the past. We're always looking at what's happening in the world around us, as in the world as a whole, and the world as in, Singapore, our immediate environment. And there are basically different pathways that people would go into. You can come here and you can major in a musical instrument, such as one of the major orchestral instruments, since that is our foundation here is the origins were Western classical orchestral music. But there we have branched out and we have gone other directions. And today we also have a recording arts degree, we have composition, but we also have an emphasis in music and society. We also have musical pathways that people can go through where they're looking at what it means to create projects in society, to try and engage people and to try and create musical events, or to embark on other things where you say, oh, look, here's a need, here's a hole, and I'm going to work on filling it. And the students, as part of their projects, create projects where they go, oh, look, here's something that nobody's working on that would create, would fill an interesting void in society. And, so a large part of what it is that we do in the conservatory is we try to have a number of pathways available so that when people come in, it's not like, oh, I just want to learn how to play this instrument really, really well. But it's like you get in because you can play this instrument really, really well. But at the same time, we also see what your trajectory is going to be long term. In other words, we are just part of your professional conduit where you say, well, this is where you're headed over here. But you coming into the conservatory, this is how we're going to help you move through this pathway and to help you be successful after you graduate. But we want to know what it is that the students want to do. And in all honesty, how many people really know what they want to do their first year of university studies? We all shift and move. It's okay. And very often the students will change that pathway while they're here. And that's okay. We can celebrate that and we can work with them because we're here to help them learn how to think. And we're here to help them develop skills that they'll be able to apply once they graduate to help them on their trajectory.
And have you seen any graduates in music who eventually ended up in a job that the student himself or herself didn't even imagine, especially when they pivot from their initial interests?
Oh, definitely. Because sometimes you have students who, I was going to say, how extreme do you want to go? Because there was one student several years ago who came in as a violinist, and I was using the visual arts in one of my classes. I was using some paintings to illustrate some things about historical values and artistic and musical styles, and the student set up an appointment with me after class and said, can I come talk to you about my interests? And I said, sure. And she came in with, for me, I recognize it in the visual arts. They've got this portfolio that you carry around with you. It's this huge bag that's usually about like 1 meter by 1.5 meter, with a handle on it. And it's like, oh, she's actually a visual artist. And she opened up this portfolio that had some really, really strong paintings in it. And I said, you're at least as good in your painting as you are on the violin. And she's like, yeah. She says, I really love doing both. And so then we had a long conversation. The question was, well, what is it that you can do where you bring these two loves together? Because we're trying to focus on in the conservatory, helping her become an orchestral violinist was kind of what she felt like she was being pushed in. And then we started talking about different possibilities. And then she actually went on and started doing a lot of other things. She actually, after graduation, after she left the conservatory, started doing things with other organizations and other artists and dancers and doing all kinds of really fun collaborative art projects. And she was loving what she was doing. So, wow. And some people come through here. And I remember one student in one class saying, Greg, I really love music, but what I really want to become is a politician. And it's like, okay, that's okay, but go ahead. Let's look at how you can use your musical skills and the pathways that you've developed in music and how you may be able to use these as a trajectory in what it is that you would rather do in a political realm. So, do you know what I mean? It's this is where we say, what is it that you want to do, and how is it that you go about doing it?
I think as millennials, it can be sometimes confusing and difficult to really find what we want to do in life. And some of the easy answers are to do what you love, and going into music could be one of the answers for them. But what you just described is that you can still go into multiple pathways, even with a degree in music. You can go into research to better understand how music impacts the human body, or you could go into the performing arts world where you play to be paid. What else? What else can musicians do from a career perspective?
Well, that's just it. It's a matter of what you want to do with it. And a lot of times we have a tendency to focus on specific things. We've had some of our graduates who have gone into orchestras, some here in Singapore with the Singapore Symphony Orchestra, Singapore Chinese orchestras. Many of them have become freelance. We call them portfolio musicians, where I play music. I do some freelance work. Maybe I have my own quartet, and we like doing our own projects, and some of them are artistic and some of them may be, playing for wedding receptions. The question is, what is it that you want to do with your art? But they may do a little bit of that, and maybe they do some private teaching on their musical instrument, and maybe they go into one of the schools and they do a little bit of things there, because we have a tendency to measure people like, oh, you're supposed to go to job at 8:30 in the morning, and you're supposed to only do that job until 6 o'clock at night. That's the mentality. Mm-hmm. But a lot of us, and I put myself in this category, a lot of us don't enjoy doing that, Andrew. A lot of us would rather go to work and say, well, I'm going to do this for a couple hours, I'm going to do that for a couple hours. Oh, I'd love to have a break for a couple hours in the middle of the day, and then it would be really fun to go do this, and then I'm going to hang out for dinner, and then I'm going to go do this for 3 hours at night. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And so I think that we need to not be so critical of people that actually piece together a career by doing a variety of different things that they love doing, and allow them the freedom to do it, because that's what a lot of people do that are musicians in the 21st century. When I was a musician, I was a portfolio musician. I didn't do just one thing, and I was always looking for new projects and thinking of things that would be interesting and fun to do and impactful. And you start getting creative in finding holes in society of what are the opportunities. For me as a musician, I play at night. What do I want to do during the day? So it's like, well, I don't want to be a school teacher, but I do like working with kids. So maybe I could create something where I go in and I work with kids during the school day for a short period of time. And we created all kinds of projects, myself and a number of other musicians, where we did just that. One of the things that we also did is we put together a Dixieland band. And we said, we're going to go into businesses and we're going to wish people happy birthday. And this is how much it costs for us. Do you know how fun it is if you walk into the middle of a workplace with, 5 horn players, and you come in playing a Dixieland piece of music, and then you play Happy Birthday Dixieland style, and you sing a couple verses that are uniquely made up for that particular person in relationship to wishing them a happy birthday. Everyone's got a huge smile on their face, and you walk out of the room just going, that was so much fun. I want to do it again. And of course, at the same time, you do something like that, if it's successful, you just handed out about another 12 to 20 business cards. You get the idea? It's like, is that bad? Is it bad for someone to do something like that, making a living? And that's why I say we have to let these people figure out. And this is what I want to do as a teacher in the conservatory. I want to give you the skills. I want you to give you the thinking abilities so that you can figure out how you can take this forward to do what you want to do. But like I said, you have to pursue your passion, but you also have to know what your funding model is. How are you going to pay the bills? Because you can't just live off of passion. And I think sometimes this is where things do go wrong, where you have somebody who says, well, I'm just going to be really, really good at this, and money is just going to fall out of the clouds on top of me. Or I'm going to do this so well that managers will come and beg me to sign contracts with me, and they're just going to give me work. It's like, well, that's La La Land, which is actually one of the highest watched movies in the last couple of weeks. I've had a lot of fun looking at what are the highest watched movies, in Netflix or the Apple Store or Amazon or these other streaming services, and it's been a lot of fun to say, what is it that people want to watch during COVID-19? What is it that people want to listen to? There's a need, and artists need to recognize there's a need, and they need to fill the need. And as long as they do that, they're going to make a living. We have to help people understand that there are voids and that it's possible to fill those voids. And there are a lot of artists that are doing just that.
Wow, Greg, I think that has been a phenomenal conversation where we went deep into the minds of a musician herself and understand the relationship between humans and the arts. It's almost like a music playing in my brain right now as I'm speaking to you all the time. As you're taking me through, like I said at the start, you're taking me through a journey where you want me to go up through mountains and through valleys and through green pastures. I think learning how to present yourself and to sell your craft is probably the most important skill that musicians need to have. And also doing what you love. But the money won't necessarily come unless you get the word out and you just work really hard to connect with people and just make them want you, right? So I think it can be really difficult as well to do that on a consistent basis, especially when sometimes you feel like, man, nobody's listening to me, or you feel discouraged with yourself. How would you advise people out there who are struggling with their craft in order for them to continue doing what they love doing?
So I tease my wife about this because sometimes we talk about, what happens when we retire? And I used to always say, when I retire, I want to become a street musician because it's the ultimate challenge. People are walking down the street. They have some place to go. They have some place they want to be. I'm not talking about Orchard Road, because people are kind of sauntering around Orchard Road. I'm here to see the sights. I'm here to no. I'm talking about, getting someplace where, it's like inside the MRT, where people are trying to go from point A to point B, or just outside the doors, or, and then you do it during rush hour. You don't do it in the middle of the day. You do it at 8 to 9 o'clock in the morning, or 5 to 7 o'clock at night, because that is the ultimate challenge. Are you good enough to actually not get someone to buy a ticket for $100 to come and hear you play in a concert hall, but can you get them to recognize that there's something else going on in the world around them when they're so focused on something else, that you can break that saunter and you can get them to want to stop and listen and go, whoa, because for me, that's what's important. If you can't connect with individuals you have a problem yourself as a guitar player. It's like, well, I'm 14 years old, I'm playing the guitar. And if you're playing the guitar and then you play for your friends and and you go, so what did you think? And they say, well, it's nice. Do you know what I mean? It's like, you don't want to hear that. You know, this is where everyone needs to go back and look at their craft and say, well, what am I doing? One of my favorite things that I did as an undergraduate student, because you're focusing on developing a lot of these technical skills so much, but at the same time, we were trying to refine our ability to connect with other people. And so we would invite each other into the practice room all the time. And so I would play the movement of a double bass sonata, for example, and say, so Andrew, what did you think? And you'd say, well, you know, I thought this worked, and you know, I really didn't care for this part. I was kind of a little bored, and you know, and it's like, oh, I thought this part was just like, I thought this was the best part of the whole song, and what were you trying to say anyway? Do you know what I mean? It's like, you need that human feedback. That human feedback is absolutely essential. And so I would say to anyone who's an artist of any kind, don't plan on being famous when you're dead, because those are extreme anomalies in the history of the arts. Most of the people that we know were fairly well known in their own day because they figured out how to connect with people then. And they began by connecting with the people immediately around them. And then those people introduced them to other people. And then those people introduced them to other people. You know, it's just like I said, going on that journey. You begin with yourself, and maybe there's a quintet, and then maybe there's an orchestra of 20, and then an orchestra of 80, and then an audience of 60,000 people. You know, but it begins with smaller human interactions. And if you can't connect with the people immediately around you, what makes you think that you can connect with the people, a stadium of 60,000 people? You know, let's start with the people that mean the most to you, and then find some people around you that don't know you very well and say, hey, do you have a couple minutes? You know, can I play for you? Will you tell me what you honestly think? And then find out whether you're really communicating what you think you communicated. It's just like writing words. You know, you thought you said one thing, and then someone misunderstood what it was that you had to say. The arts are no different.
It's actually a communication between you as an artist and your listeners, and you're trying to communicate something through a medium, which is your art. And you're trying to get a feedback whether they got the same message that you're trying to convey to them. Indeed. And the ability to do that really well makes you a good artist. I
was going to say many pieces to the puzzle. Yeah, but that is certainly one very important piece of the puzzle. Definitely.
Greg, thank you very much for this time, and really pleasure to talk to you through this conversation.
Thank you very much, Andrew. Had a very enjoyable time visiting with you, and I hope it's of value and benefit to some of your listeners.
Thank you, Greg.
Thank you.
Hey there, thank you so much for watching this episode of the Careers of Millennials podcast. Let me know in the comments below on what you think, and be sure to hit the like, subscribe, and notification button to support my channel and bring you more Careers of Millennials.